So when I looked at Madeleine McCann, I did exactly the same. I brought all the information together. I read all the police files. I spoke to all those key witnesses around there. Sadly, evidence tells us that she would have been dead within 72 hours.
Oh, God. Awful. So, Mark, obviously we've met you before and we've done a piece with you before, but for new watchers or new listeners, would you mind giving us a brief introduction to who you are?
So my name's Mark Williams-Thomas. I'm an investigative reporter and a criminologist, and my background really is in policing. So I was a detective. I then left the police service, went into television, and that's, I suppose, where people get to know me from in relation to my investigations. I have a series on Netflix called The Investigator, and I'm probably best known for exposing Jimmy Savile.
I mean, that was very concise, but there's an incredible amount of life experience in there. So I think what we'll do is go back to the start and maybe, you said you started off in the police. So how did you get there?
I began in Guildford. I worked on the beat, as everybody used to do. It's changed now, but you used to have to go and put your time on the ground, walking the cobbled streets, as it were. So I did that for just over a year. And then I thought, it's probably time for another change. And there was a job that came up, actually a new job. It's now common for police service to have community safety teams. So these are teams that work with people in the community to try and keep them out of the criminal justice system, really. And we set up a vulnerable youth team. And I was the vulnerable youth officer for the whole of the Guildford Borough. And the purpose was to try and keep children out of the criminal justice system. So once you get into the criminal justice system, it's a conveyor belt. It's really difficult to get off it. So what I looked at is a youth diversionary policy to try and keep people away from crime in the first place, so that you didn't end up going into that role constantly of seeing the same faces over and over again. But what it did identify for me was the need for safeguarding of children, because the large majority of the children I was dealing with, so these all under 18s, were coming from disrupted, broken homes, environments where they were not being safeguarded, they were subject to child abuse. And it kind of opened up that whole area. And I became really fascinated in child abuse, in the abuse of children, and seeing what I could do from a policing point of view to try and reduce that. And that's kind of where my path then started to go down the area of child protection. I then started to get involved in a lot of major crime, and then I moved into a major crime team. From there, became a detective, and finished up in the police service working on a paedophile unit. Because what happened is I identified that there was a major problem with paedophilia across the whole of the country, not being prosecuted, not being investigated. And it was kind of in a bit of a too difficult area. For a long time, offenders were being allowed to get away with their crime because it didn't fall into an area, really. It didn't fall into an area of interfamiliar abuse, so within a family environment. And it felt slightly into the too difficult area because CID officers didn't really want to deal with child abuse. So, the gangs, the organised crime that was taking place, the vicar, the school teacher, the choir master who was actually abusing children on a large scale, but no one was really doing the investigation to stop that. So I went out and I started to arrest some pretty high profile people and got a bit of a name for myself within the force as being, kind of like going after paedophiles. And I managed, after a long campaign, to get the Assistant Chief Constable of Surrey to finally agree to set up a paedophile unit. And it did. And I went and worked on that until I finally left the force.
After the police, was it private detective? Is that what you moved into?
Yeah, in essence, really. I moved across to doing private detective work and then into television.
Yes,
very quickly.
Yes. Because first of all, what I want to ask you about is, as a private investigator, what would you say were the main differences between that and police work?
So I think it's quite simple, really. So obviously, as a police officer, I've got access to computer systems. I've got powers that I don't have as a private detective, so I can arrest people. I can, I can use those powers to gain evidence from people. I've got regulatory powers, surveillance, some of the techniques that you use, bugging, listening devices, all of that stuff. at my disposal. And I've got some of that at my disposal now, but obviously it's slightly different. You know, if I wanted to gain access to someone's house, to be able to put a listening device in someone's house, then I can go through that process through a court order, get that order, get into someone's house as a police officer, put the bug in there, disappear, and nobody knows I've been in the house. You know, the intelligence services do it all the time. But obviously I haven't got that access as a police officer. So my ability to get into someone's house and do some of those things is obviously reduced. So powers and access to computers is the biggest thing. But as a private detective, I've still got access to techniques. So I just have to be cleverer. So I just have to be able to use the abilities to be able to gain access to people in a way that perhaps they aren't aware of.
Sure.
In a more discreet way.
Can you give us any examples?
Well, I mean, you know, we might use decoys to be able to get to people. You know, Amazon deliveries are great in getting items into people's houses.
Oh, can you actually do that?
Yeah, why not?
Well, okay, fine. As in,
I mean, one's got to show that there is there's a serious case that you're investigating. I mean, you couldn't start doing those types of things if you're investigating a theft or something like that. But if you're investigating, a murder, an unsolved murder, or somebody wanted for rape or something like that, or firearms offences, then the proportionality of what you're doing justifies the ends. So. We lump cars, and by lumping, so we put trackers on cars, so tracking on cars. We did the very first tracker on a car that ITV ever did. I remember I've got a friend who was a solicitor for MI5, and I was speaking to him, and I said to him, listen, I'd love to put a tracker on the car, but my lawyer at ITV will not let me do it. And he said, well, let me have a chat with him, and he says, you can do it. He says, obviously there's restrictions, but, we do it. And anyway, about an hour later, I remember getting an email from the solicitor going, yes, we can do it, but you've just got to be really careful that you do it in a certain way. And within a matter of, I remember that evening, getting the tracker and heading off to our target's address for that evening in the early hours of the morning, about 3 o'clock in the morning, to get up and put a tracker on the car. And it was great because it was the first time it had ever been used in television. We put a tracker on this car, and I remember going back and then you just wait for the phone to ping.
Wow.
So you put a geolocate on it, fixes it to a certain location, and the phone pings, and off we go, and we follow this car.
So in a way, it's probably easier to put a tracker in a car in your current position than it was when you're in the police, because I suppose as to want to do it in the police, although you've got the legal backing of it, you have to go through a huge system of application and all that kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, I think the process in terms of getting things now is other than the police service, obviously much quicker. Yes, you can. The ability to be able to get some of the devices is harder because, I can't tap someone's phone. I can't get into physically get into someone's house and put a listening device in there. But there are sometimes other ways of doing it. There may well be that we know somebody within that house who is prepared to put a device somewhere or record something.
And you can put a listening device inside someone's house.
Well, the person would have to do it themselves. So they'd have to be somebody who's physically within that house who's prepared to record something or do something. But it's all about proportionality. It's all about what is it we're trying to do? What is it we're trying to achieve? If somebody's on the run for very serious offences, then there is a justification for doing things.
That makes sense. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like what helps is when you were talking about the tracker on the car, it sounds like what helped that become a possibility was a very in-depth knowledge of the law and how you can do things and how you can't do things. Do you ever feel exposed for that? Because then if a policeman comes along, catches you doing it, and you say, no, it's okay to do that as long as and they don't have that in-depth knowledge, they might say, doesn't sound right.
Yeah, I mean, I remember we did a surveillance on this person's address, and the producer said, first of all, he said, I'm going to sit in the bin, right? As in a wheelie bin.
Oh, wow.
Outside this address. And he hadn't done any surveillance before. And I said, believe me, you're not going to sit in a wheelie bin for very long. I said, it might be fine for a while, but you can't move. It's ridiculous. I said, lie in the back of the car. I said, well, park the car further away and you can lie in the back of the car. Anyway, he did. But he then decided that he was going to move the car, I think it was, or he was moving around too much within this car. And a neighbour saw him moving an awful lot and phoned up the police. And then the next thing, the police turned up. And then he phoned up and said, oh, the police are here. Anyway, we managed to get the police and take them away from the target's address, talk to them elsewhere and say, look, we're done running an operation, we're running this. The police service I have great relationships with the police service. I get on very well with them. And, we have a good dialogue most of the time.
It's really interesting. So you've moved from the police force where you sort of ended up doing a lot of work with children.
Yeah.
And then you moved into the kind of private investigator world and the TV work started to come alongside that at a similar time. Where was it that the Jimmy Savile thing came in?
So I'd done quite a lot of television stuff. So I'd probably done quite a lot of ITV Tonight programs. I went over and confronted a paedophile priest in Germany who sat in an internet cafe and told me about all his offending, just to camera. Incredible, really. But I think, that's
broke down.
Yeah, we'd be following him for a little while. And the exec said to me, he needs to be, I said to him, he needs to be confronted. He said, well, are you up for that? I said, yeah, of course I am. It's just everything I used to do in the police service. I just went and confronted him, and for half an hour he told me about all his offending behaviour.
Wow. And was he prosecuted?
Yeah, he was prosecuted and convicted for he had a load of child abuse material as well as grooming a child.
Right.
So I did that, and then I did a lot of other crime stuff. So I did quite a few Tonights around crime stuff. And then I was working I think I was working on another Tonight programme or I'd be doing stuff. Actually, those days I used to do quite a lot for BBC Newsnight as well. And then I was just coming back from BBC Newsnight, having filmed a piece in Interpol. I'd gone over to Interpol to deal with child rescue alert, child trafficking. And I was just coming back and the producer said to me, have you ever heard anything about Jimmy Savile being a sex offender? And I went, no. I said, he's a weird bloke. I said, I wouldn't want him anywhere near kids, but no, I've never heard anything like that.
What year was this?
So this is 2011. He was picking up audiences of 15, 17 million a night. He was phenomenal. He was across, there was only 2 television channels. There was ITV and BBC at those days. BBC One, BBC Two. He was across it on a Saturday night, BBC One. He was it. An absolute star really in terms of television, worldwide known as well. Big profile.
So the thought, I guess, some of the nervousness is the fact that you're not going after someone that people are suspicious of already at that point in time. You're going after someone that you're going to be telling them, that person you've enjoyed watching all of your life, because he started so early, like late 60s.
Yeah, 60s all the way through. And of course, he'd become stable diet for many, many families. On a Saturday night, watching Jim Will Fix It, Top of the Pops. He'd become iconic in the way that he was, and people kind of accepted him. It became that, that face of Saturday night television. So I was taking on something which was pretty massive. 2011. So the producer said to me, have you ever heard anything? I went, no, not at all. I said, it's weird. And he said, well, he was arrested by a police service for child abuse offences, for sexual offences. And I went, I'd never heard that. He said, well, it was interesting enough. It was either your old force or Sussex. And I said, well, I've not heard that, but I'll make some inquiries and I'll see. I said, what are you going to do with it? He said, well, we can't do a programme until he's dead. No one will touch it. And I said, that's a shame. And I said, what have you got? He said, well, and it became a bit convoluted because basically he was a producer and his aunt was at a children's home where Jimmy Savile used to visit. And so that's how he knew the story really. And there was quite a lot. I then looked online and I read quite a lot of stuff naming Jimmy Savile as a sex offender. And a number of other celebrities. So we spoke a little bit about it, and I said, look, I'll make some inquiries. I then managed to find out, using contacts of mine, that yes, Savile had been interviewed at Stoke Mandeville by the police in relation to some allegations of sexual offences.
And you couldn't find this out on the internet?
No.
This was, right. So this was secret?
Yeah. So I'd found it out. And actually I found it out from somebody who was a very senior officer who told me it. And I think the moment he told me it, he then thought, what have I just said? Because he told me that. And then I tried to speak to him about 4 or 5 days later and he wouldn't talk to me.
Right, okay.
So he realized, what have I just said? I've opened up this can of worms. Anyway, I went back to the producer and said, look, he has been arrested. Sorry, he has been interviewed in relation to these allegations, but no further actions coming from it. And he said, okay, that's a shame.
And what are you feeling at the moment? Because you've been looking online, you've spoken to this person.
I mean...
Are you like, or do you think something...
No, there's clearly more to it.
Right.
There was clearly more to it. And I said to him, what are you going to do with it? He said, well, we've got somebody that's going to present it and we're just kind of working it up and see where we go. But, we can't do anything at the moment. And then fast forward a couple of months, not very long, and he dies. Savile dies. And I remember thinking to myself, gosh, that's your moment. He's now. Because you can't be sued by the dead. So I thought, there's your moment. And I remember he phoned me up. He said, we're going to do it. He said, would you give us an interview in relation to that because of your background in terms of dealing with very high-profile offenders in the police service? And I dealt with a number of high-profile offenders in the police service. And
when you were in the police? Or?
Yeah, when I was in the police. So during the police service, I worked on a number of very high-profile cases. And so I said to him, yeah, no problem at all. And then it went to the editor of Newsnight. And the editor of Newsnight totally missed the ball here because he said, well, there is no story because Surrey police don't seem to have failed in their investigation. They dealt with it appropriately. And I remember saying to him, but that's not the story. The story is that Jimmy Savile's a sex offender.
Yeah.
It's not the secondary whether or not the police failed in their investigation. So he said, well, that's it. We're shutting it down. We're not doing anything. And I remember saying to him, well, there's something here. I don't know what it is yet. And there's something here. And I said, but would you be happy for me to take it on? Journalistic wise, you don't want to tread on someone else's toes if he feels that he's going to continue doing it. He said, well, it's dead for me. I can't do anything with it.
This is a producer saying
yeah, he said, it's dead for me. I can't. He said, I'll help you all I can. He said, obviously I have to be careful because of my role. But I said, I'll help you all I can. So I said, well, let me run with it. Let me see what I can find. And I remember, and all they had at that moment in time is they had a complainant at the children's home, not allegations against Savile, but again, allegations against another offender, but talking about how Savile would go to that place. Okay. And obviously they had the details of the other offences that took place that they'd been interviewed for. So I started to think there's more to this. And I remember going to ITV and I remember saying to the lawyer, there is something in this. There is definitely something in this, but we need to run with it. Anyway, the lawyer was incredibly nervous. The exec said, well, Mark, listen, why don't you and Leslie, who was my producer, why don't the two of you work on it and see where you go? And I remember we started to work on it. And there's a couple of decisions I made. I said, one is we'll keep everything on paper, off computer. So we weren't putting anything on computer. I didn't want this story to leak. I didn't want this story to be looked at by the people. We had to keep it really tight. I think that the senior bosses within ITV started to slightly hear about what was going on, and there was definitely nervousness, massive nervousness. I remember one occasion when somebody from the one of the teams turned around and said, well, you need to go and get a consent form signed before you do the interview, the day before, and you have to tell them exactly what it's all about and then see if they're happy to do it. And I said, what are you talking about? I said, I'll do it in the same way as I would do any other consent. I'm not going to give them it the day before. We've talked about it all.
And just for people listening that aren't aware of how all the TV stuff works and all that. So when already it sounds like when you're discussing this particular project, it feels as though you're meeting resistance. Maybe not huge amounts of resistance, but you're nervous about people hearing about it. You're getting nervousness from lawyers. Is that equivalent to other shows you've done where you've gone and exposed the priest in Germany? Is it always that resistance around exposing a paedophile? Because if you get it wrong, it's so dangerous. Or did you feel that because it was Savile specifically, there was an extra layer of resistance there? Yeah,
I think as in the initial stages, it was the same nervousness. I wouldn't say resistance. The same nervousness existed within the senior management because, of course, its reputation. And, ITV example is a PLC. It's not it's not funded by you and I, like the BBC is. And so there's a nervousness for its shareholders, rightfully so. You don't want to get something like that wrong.
No.
And so it was about the same as doing any risky program I do. And I do a lot of risky programs. But then that nervousness did increase. And the nervousness increased because I think there was a reality of quite what we were doing. And then when we started to find victims, we found 5 victims, we found 6 victims. I remember going back to the bosses and saying, we found them. And they said, well, keep looking. And I remember saying at one stage, how many do you want?
Yeah.
Because one of the very clear things I do in all my programs is that if I'm going to interview somebody, then that will appear in the program. Right. I work, particularly if they're a victim. If they're a contributor, it's a very different matter, an expert or whatever it is. But if they're a victim and they're giving me their victim account, one's got to be really careful how we treat people. So I would use that in the program. And so we'd reached a point where the evidence was really, really, really strong. And I remember going back to the bosses and they said, it is good, but I think we probably need somebody just to run it past and see what their view is. So I said, well, okay, let's use 2 people. So I used a barrister who I knew, QC, and he said, look, the evidence is pretty compelling there. And then I used Esther Ransom.
Wow.
And Esther, I know Esther very well, and I phoned Esther up and I said, listen, Esther, it's slightly strange this, but I'm investigating Jimmy Savile. So obviously said, look, this is all in confidence. I'm investigating Jimmy Savile. I've got 3 videos I'd like you to watch of complainants giving their accounts. And I don't want to preempt it. I don't want to show you anything before. I just want to come around your house, show you these 3 videos, film it all, and I want your response. And of course, she knew Savile. She was part of the BBC.
But for anyone that might not be aware, Esther Ransom is a quite famous British TV personality.
Oh, yes. I mean, Esther Ransom set up Childline. So Childline is the telephone number in the UK where children, people can phone up about being abused. She has done an incredible amount of work for safeguarding of children. She is a leader right up the front, leading in relation to safeguarding of children for many, many decades now. And so a real authority in terms of that. And, and a lovely lady, I get on with her very, very well. And I said to her, look, I'm going to show you these. And I remember turning up at her house. She's quite fierce. It's very different. As a presenter of a program, you get a very different response sometimes than if you're a producer or a researcher. And she can be quite fierce. And I remember she was quite fierce to my producer.
Well, I'll change it to a very famous British personality rather than quite famous.
And I remember sitting down and I said, right, I'm just going to play this. And I played it. And you could, as she was watching this, you could feel kind of like I suppose anger coming through, but also she was in the moment and she cried. And she cried, and they were genuine tears, absolutely genuine tears. And she said, you know what? I believe them, absolutely believe them. We gave him a platform and we allowed him to abuse. And it was kind of like a moment of thought, that's it. That's the moment. That's the definitive moment that, I live in this world and I've investigated him for a year. But when you get somebody outside who looks at this, who's got some knowledge and looks at it and goes, do you know what? I believe that.
Were you categorically certain that he was a prolific sex offender?
Yeah. I mean, in the months prior to that, no doubt about it. No doubt about it. He'd got away with it for a very long time and being able to use his power to get away with it. I had no doubt about it. And there was, as it was going on, more and more people, I was finding more and more information from people, more and more victims were coming forward. Yeah, no doubt about it at all. And the eve of, so the program went out midweek. And I remember on the Sunday, the Mail on Sunday, we'd given an exclusive to Mail on Sunday. And they bottled it and they put it on page 6 or 7. I remember them saying to me, is that enough information really? Have you got any more you can give us? And I remember that's it. And then the Sunday Mirror and the Sunday People who I'd got a very good relationship with, I gave them some other stuff and they ran it on the front page. And it ran consecutively for 41 days on the front pages of the newspapers, the Jimmy Savile story. That's how big it was. It was phenomenal here. And more and more information coming out all the time. 41 consecutive days, his story sat on the front pages. And that's how big it was. I mean, it got mentioned in the House of Commons. I got specifically mentioned by Tim Layton, the children's minister there, about the work that we'd done. It's collected, numerous amounts of awards. But ultimately, that was only possible because of the braveness of the women who came forward. Had they not have given me their accounts and allowed me to use it on television, we wouldn't have succeeded, because I needed them to be listened to. I needed them to be believed. I crafted it, yes, and I took the weight and the force of it from them. But ultimately, they were the reason it happened. And some people would say, yeah, but you never brought justice. Well, that wasn't down to me. I'm not out this as this Cape Crusader who wears a cape and fighting for people's justice at all costs. Yes, I go out there and I do my best, but ultimately that's the system, and the system was such that he evaded justice before he died.
Well, also, you didn't know he was going to die, right?
Well, he evaded justice before he died. Yeah. The authorities had the opportunity to get him if they'd have done a proper investigation, and they failed. They categorically failed, on a seismic scale when they could have done, because all the information that I had was available had they have done some investigations when they interviewed him in the early 2000s. So I didn't do anything different. I just was thorough in my investigation, whereas they were utterly unthorough in their investigation.
And what year did it go out, the document?
2012.
Yeah, because I remember I was working at the BBC when it went out, and I watched it. And I remember there was what it felt like was there was a little tipping point where it went out. Everyone was talking about it. But for about 3 or 4 days, there was all these accounts there was arguments about whether it was true or lies, and they were being broadcast, they were in papers, and people were saying he'd never do that. And then it just felt like this dam cracking, and suddenly it was just like an outpouring of more and more and more information just spraying out across, just decades of horrific abuse coming to light. And I remember a lot of the conversation was, I was obviously younger, it was just like a lot of the conversation me and my peers were having is like, how the hell has this happened?
Yeah. Well, it could have been stopped. The police service had plenty of opportunities over the decades to stop it, but they didn't. And because nobody ever did a thorough investigation.
But why?
That was the problem. Well, because they were incompetent. Individual officers were incompetent. They failed to properly investigate him. I think they were overcome by power and an influence. When you're a police officer, you don't tend to probably meet many famous people. And so it depends on you as a character as to how you cope with that. And I think that as a result of that influences sometimes your decision making. And we've seen it. We saw it with Savile. We saw it with the Lost Prophet singer when the police got a bit in awe of him. So I think that's it. I know lots of famous people. I've worked with an awful lot of them. I work very closely with Simon Cowell. We work together on projects, and so I've seen. I've mixed with all the A-lists. I know them, and I think probably for me it was like, do you know what? He's just like anyone else. But I don't think the police officers saw that, and they certainly didn't see that when they were investigating it.
Well, that's one side of it, is the police officers, and that I feel like that's a very logical, reasonable account of why these kind of things might have happened. But the other side of it is the people who put him on TV.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that came out afterwards was people saying, oh, I'd heard stuff. And even, I remember Louis Theroux did like a kind of like a piece after his passing and said there were always rumours about him. And that's one of the other things that I think people have been confused about, is that if it was this weird open secret, how was he just on primetime TV for so long? Well,
Dame Janet Smith came out. She did a review for the BBC, and her review was pretty flawed, really, because ultimately it got the right conclusion, but the outcome of it was then flawed, because she said, there were senior managers within the BBC, particularly the radio setup, who had information. But then they did nothing with it. But she doesn't criticise them in any way at all. It's ridiculous. So let's be very clear. There were people out there, senior managers within the BBC, who could have stopped it, who could have stopped this, because they could have stopped him from being involved in his programmes, could have stopped the process. But they didn't do anything. They ignored that process. There are other people who had a lot of information but were powerless, nurses, victims of his. Who's going to listen to them? No one was going to listen to him. He was incredibly litigious. He wrote litigious letters all the time. In other words, letters from solicitors telling people you can't say anything. So people were silenced. He was very, very powerful. But there were people within management, within the BBC and other setups, who could have done something. And I hope those people have restless sleep about it all. It probably back to normal now, but they need to be held accountable. And this is the problem with the whole of the Savile. When Netflix came to me and said, would I be involved in their Netflix program? I said, there's only one program I will make, and that is holding those people to account. I can tell you there are people out there, and I did a Savile update which started to look at some of those people who should be held to account. But there is a program still to be made to hold Savile to account. And there are people out there who will fall under that. There are at least 5 or 6 people that I could investigate and name who knew information and failed to do anything
because they were
about it.
scared, or they didn't care, or what's your opinion on it?
Well, I think it's very difficult to judge that, whether they were scared. I think they were probably scared of putting their head above the parapet. I think they were scared of their position. I think they were probably uncertain about quite what to do. And they were in awe of his power. I mean, one of the massive problems is that Savile was earning money for the BBC and for other organisations. Savile was this face. So if you suddenly say, do you know what? We're going to get rid of that. And of course, what's the fallout from that? It's huge because people start asking questions. So for some people, it's much easier to do nothing, even though that's the wrong thing to do, than to do the right thing. Now, I've never been like that. If I make myself unpopular, which I have done and do by doing things, if I've done it for the right reasons, then I can sleep at night and I can hold my head up high.
Well, when you talk about making yourself unpopular, am I right in thinking there was actually some sort of device sent to you?
Yeah, I have death threats. I've been threatened to be shot. I've had child abuse material sent to me. I've had an incendiary device sent to me. I'm very careful. I'm just about to start on a new project where I've been told that the people that we are going after will come after us.
Why would you do that?
Because I care. Because I care to help. And I don't say this in a spiritualistic way, is I've been put on this earth, I think, to help people. And I'm here making a difference in whatever way I can, and mine is through journalism, through investigations. I've been incredibly successful and I continue to be. And I'm passionate about what I do. And I don't think anybody should be silenced if they have the right thing to say or if they've been let down. And, I'm here now, 52 years old, and I've survived threats and I'll be here for a lot longer. It's those people that I don't know about I probably should be more worried about. I've dealt with some pretty nasty people across my life and I'm still here. So, bring it on. If you're going to do that, then, well, let's see.
What you've been doing, and in a funny way, your career sort of set you up for the Savile thing, because it was policing. Oh yeah, I couldn't have done it without that. Without the background, children, and then you've got the private investigation, and that all kind of leads up to this. But looking at it from the outside, and when you're talking about these kind of, going off into Cambodia and all that kind of thing, some people might go, I'm going to donate £100 to charity a month.
Yeah.
What you're doing is ultimately putting yourself into potentially danger, well, potentially mortal danger when you're off in these foreign lands with people that you say are very dangerous people. What is it? Is it a sense of injustice that annoys you about it? Or what is it that makes you have that passion to put yourself into such a dangerous situation rather than go, I'm going to go after another German priest?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a number of things, isn't it? I mean, I think I can't deny the fact that there's an adrenaline element to it. Also, it's, being a police officer, being in that position where you're frontline and you're changing things and you're responding to things. Of course, there's an adrenaline buzz to that. But that adrenaline buzz, is a process out of why am I doing it in the first place? Why am I doing it? I'm doing it because I want to help people. I feel that I have the skills and the ability and the contacts to make a difference to people's lives. I want to shine a light in the darkest of corners. I want to give a voice to those people who have been let down by the authorities. I get incredibly angry with injustice. I get incredibly angry with incompetence. And particularly when I see something is wrong, I want to fix it. I'm a fixer. It's... if whatever's going wrong in someone's life when they're close to me, I want to fix it. And, and I'll come up with all those options how to do it. That's what I am. And I think when someone comes to me with that injustice, I think of it and go, I can help you. I can make a difference.
With Savile, I think for a lot of the British public, that will have come out of nowhere. There'll be people that work in media and might have heard stuff. There'll be people, there was always jokes because he worked with kids, but there's jokes about anyone that works with kids, right? But for a lot of people, that will have come out of nowhere. Do you think that's a once in a generation thing? Or do you think that's something that came to light and behind the scenes, there's other things going on that could come to light with enough investigation?
So I think we have to understand what Savile was about. Savile had this platform created in best part by him, but also by the environment that he was in and by those people that allowed him to have the platform that he had. He was fairly, I probably would go say, he was untouchable. And as a result of that, he was allowed to do what he wants. Now, if you put that into today's society, it's very different. There wasn't the social media. There wasn't the platform to expose him that there is today. You know, you couldn't get away with those things today because someone would write a blog, someone would do a social media post, someone would do something about it and talk up. And society is far less accepting of wrong as it was in those days. You know,
do you think so?
Oh yeah, I mean, you know, the whole Me Too movement has been brilliant because actually, you know, and people would say off the back of Savile and some of the other people arrested, yeah, but it was only touching. It was wrong. It was wrong back in the 60s. It was wrong back in the 50s. And it's wrong today. Because people got away with it doesn't make it right. Societies and our perceptions have changed. We've become much more educated about what is right and what is wrong, what is acceptable for us to have happen to our own bodies. So I think there is a massive change. And actually, misogyny is a huge thing as well. You know, misogyny existed within the police service and still does to a small degree now, but to a massive degree. I mean, I did a big investigation for a program recently on the Yorkshire Ripper. You know, this is a man who killed 13 women in Yorkshire in the 1980s, attempted to murder 7 others that he was convicted of. And the misogyny that stopped him from being caught much earlier was horrific. You know, if you were a prostitute in the 1980s and 90s, you have no value. You weren't considered to have the same value as other people. And society still does that to a degree now. You know, everyone has a value on their head. Some people are worth more than others. That's the reality. It's shocking, but that's the reality. It's less so now, but it certainly was a huge problem in the 80s and 90s. So Savile, to exist today, I don't believe could get away with it. There are other people who have offended in the 80s and 90s on a large scale, not to the scale of Savile, I don't think, but to a large scale, who are still at large. There are people offending today who are still at large on both a child abuse point of view and also other major criminal offences. So, yes, I think there is definitely offenders out there who have got very serious offences behind them on a large scale. Do I think that they're on the scale of Savile? No. And because offending is about 2 key aspects: access and opportunity. Access to your victim and the opportunity to offend. And if you look at Savile had access to his victims on a huge scale. He created television programs that gave him access to children. He did all this work, gave him access to children. And the opportunity, he was given the opportunity to be alone with children, to have that opportunity to offend. So as an offender, you've got to have access and opportunity to offend to whoever your victim is going to be. And Savile had that in abundance. There are offenders out there who are still to be brought to justice, but I don't believe there are any of them on the scale of Savile.
Okay. Yes. I mean, I'm not sure what my response is there, because I want to say, well, that's good, but it's definitely not good if you're saying that there are still offenders out there on a large scale, in fact.
There are. I mean, majority of child offenders, child abusers, will have abused in excess of 100 children.
My God.
By the time they're caught. But, you know, offenders offend with a pretty insatiable appetite at times. You know, some of these people will offend huge amounts before they end up being caught. You know, the first time you get caught shoplifting will not be the first time you've shoplifted. Yeah. So if you use that analogy across the board, and it's exactly the same. You know, the first time you get caught, unless you're very unlucky, you know, won't be the first time you've committed that offence. And offenders are the same. And what we know about child sex offenders is they are Their offending behavior is something that it's repetitiveness, and it is a creature of habit. And we know that child offenders work on a cycle of offending. So rather like a drug, the first time you commit your sexual offense, you get a height as a result of that, right, for an offender. But it's very hard then to get that height again. But you enter this cycle of offending, which is exactly the same as drugs. Your first hit and you keep going and you go. And it takes something to stop you on that cycle of offending so that you don't continue to offend. Now, sometimes those barriers that are in the place to stop you do stop you. The likelihood of getting caught, I'm going to lose my family, I'm going to lose my job, I might go to jail, my reputation's going to be damaged. But there are people who use cognitive distortion to get over those barriers. And by cognitive distortion, I mean they're able to justify in their head that actually they won't suffer that. I won't get caught. The police are rubbish. They won't catch me. Oh, it's okay for now, sex offenders, because there's so many of them. And actually, people turn a blind eye to that. It's okay. I can still work because they'll still employ me because I don't work with children. So this justification in your head the whole time, this cognitive distortion that everyone uses every day. Set off to work in the morning and you might use cognitive distortion. I drove 40 miles an hour in a 30 mile an hour speed limit. I didn't drive 50. It was only 40. That's cognitive distortion. People use it all the time to justify why they're doing something, which is wrong. But in the same way as there are, thousands of child sex offenders out there, there are also thousands of killers out there. I did a huge piece of work recently in England, Wales and Scotland, and there are nearly 3,000 unsolved murders.
Oh my God.
Since the 1960s. Unsolved murders. And that is a shocking number. So you think to yourself, okay, so if there's 3,000 unsolved murders, and that's purely classified unsolved, so there'll still be people who are missing that have not been classified as unsolved murders. So if there are 3,000 unsolved murders, there are offenders out there.
3,000 murderers.
Well, or a number of serial killers.
Oh my God, that's even worse.
I often refer to things, you just imagine you go to the shop and the person holding the door actually could be a killer. We walk past them all the time. And the problem is, of course, is offenders don't wear something different to anybody else. They don't walk along with a bag, a loot bag on their back, or they don't walk along with tattooed across their forehead saying, I'm a paedophile. They live amongst us.
From one high-profile case, the Savile one, you mentioned earlier another high-profile case involving a child, which is Madeleine McCann.
Yeah.
Were you saying that's a documentary you're currently working on?
No, so finished it. It went out on Channel 5 a couple of months ago, and it's just about to land on Paramount Plus, so actually next week.
Paramount Plus, wow.
Next week, 3-parter, and it was for the very first time. So when I got approached to make it, I'd made lots of Madeleine McCann investigations. I was on the ground when Madeleine disappeared within 72 hours.
Were you? I didn't know that.
Yeah, so I flew out to Praia da Luz and I was on the ground within 72 hours covering it for Sky News and covered it, for about 10 days, morning, evening, doing, live talks outside. And it became part of my life, a huge part of my life, actually. It kind of took over at times because it was such a massive story, and massive, I mean worldwide. In my time in covering television, I've probably covered the biggest crime stories. So obviously Jimmy Savile, I covered Madeleine McCann, I got the world exclusive interview with Oscar Pistorius, murders in cases where people have admitted murder to me, some huge, huge cases out there. And I think, Madeleine McCann sits right up the top of that in terms of profile, in terms of coverage. And I finally said, okay, let's make a program about it, but let's do it in a different way. And we know over the last couple of years, there was a suspect named by the Germans, Christian B. And I said, let's go and investigate what they have on him. And I started to investigate it. And we went on the road for 6 weeks, Germany, Portugal. And we did a years-long investigation. And we got access to Christian B through his lawyer, talked to him in prison, very close to getting an interview with him in prison, but the prison authorities refused us to do that. And we basically uncovered an alibi for him.
Oh, wow.
To show that actually the German authorities are wrong. And it's now become a slight battle between the German prosecutor and me, where the German prosecutor has been quite critical of me and I've been critical of him. He's absolutely responsible for murdering Madeleine McCann. Well, no, I don't think he is for a start, but ultimately that's not your call. That's the court's call to make that. But the sad reality is as long as we go looking, or as long as the country is focused on looking for Christian B's evidence, and of which they've been investigating him now for nearly 4 years, and they haven't got enough evidence to prosecute him, that tells you it all. The real killer is out there.
This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. On this podcast, we meet lots of people who have varied life experiences, but the through line that we always get from almost all of them is that talking helps. Often people think therapy is about big things, or for people with huge problems, but in my experience personally, therapy's been about small things just as much as big things. If you're suffering and you've got problems, talking to licensed therapists and counsellors is a way to get tools that will help you deal with them in your daily life. As the world's largest therapy service, BetterHelp has matched 3 million people with professionally licensed and vetted therapists available 100% online. Plus, it's affordable. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to match with a therapist. If things aren't clicking, you can easily switch to a new therapist anytime. It couldn't be simpler. No waiting rooms, no traffic, no endless searching for the right therapist. Learn more and save 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/minuteswith. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/minuteswith.
So it's interesting you say the real killer is out there, yeah. So I've listened to a lot of podcasts on Madeleine McCann, and as somebody who doesn't have the experience that you do and is just kind of listening to different people present different types of evidence, I'll listen to one and go, oh, well, clearly that's what happened. Mm-hmm. I'll listen to the second and go, oh, God, clearly that's what happened.
Yeah.
And then maybe the third will actually just disprove the first two.
Yeah.
As someone who's been investigating it since the beginning, have you had a changing opinion, or have you had an opinion that has stayed fairly solid throughout?
No, so the thing is with opinions is it's important not to give an opinion until you've got all the evidence that supports that opinion. And of course, it's really important to listen to all the evidence. So one of the things that I do with any investigation is I take on board all the evidence that comes in. And before I determine the outcome or what I believe, I've heard everything. I did a program about Diana, Princess Diana. Mm-hmm. So it's just got out worldwide, Princess Diana, the Untold, the ultimate truth. And actually what I did is I didn't know whether Princess Diana was murdered by the authorities, by the establishment, the royal family, the intelligence services, or was it a tragic accident? And I set off on this path to find out, and ultimately established through evidence very clearly, it's a very thorough investigation, it was a tragic accident. And so when I looked at Madeleine McCann, I did exactly the same. I brought all the information together. I read all the police files. I spoke to all those key witnesses around there. And, I had a contact via, not directly, but via one person removed with the family. And so I was able to pull all this information together. And my conclusion is that on that night of Madeleine's disappearance, she woke up looking for mum and dad, and she'd been told the morning that if she were to wake up, the parents were only in the tapas bar, which was just across the courtyard, because what we do know is Sean Amelie's, the brother and sister, had woken up on the previous nights a number of times, and I suspect as a result of that, Madeleine thought, well, where is mum and dad? Because they'd been out on those previous nights as well. And so I believe she woke up. She left the apartment. We know the apartment was insecure. So the back patio door was open. And the reason it was open was to allow some flow of air. It was very hot. And there was no air conditioning in those apartments. And so I believe she got up and she went wandering and looking for her parents. And in order to come out of that apartment, you have to go onto the main road where there's a footpath, to travel down the footpath, to then go back into the apartment to go to where the tapas bar is. And I believe that nobody went into the apartment. Madeleine left that apartment that night. Everything supports that. There's no evidence that suggests somebody has gone into that apartment. And there is evidence when you look at cases, and I did I did a lot of research around child abductions, and actually so much so that I went over to Texas and spoke with the FBI at a conference around child abductions, looking at our cases, looking at the cases I have. And we've got two very prominent cases in the UK. Jeanette Tate, who went missing in the 1970s, she was cycling up at the top of the hill, down the top of the hill. She was a matter of minutes away from her friends. And by the time they got to the bottom of the hill, her bike was on the floor and she'd vanished. Matter of minutes, 90 seconds to 2-3 minutes. And then we've got Sarah Payne, who went missing. She vanished. She was walking out with her parents. They were walking across a field. She went through this hole in a fence. And as she went through this hole in the fence, parents were just behind. And as they come through that, she's vanished. God. Fortunately, Sarah's brother sees a white van just drive away. And that was the Roy Whiting, who was the kidnapper who took her. And what that tells you is that on both of those occasions, we don't know who abducted Jeanette Tate, although we think it's Black, who's now dead. But in relation to Roy Whiting, who did abduct Sarah Payne, what we know is it was utterly unplanned.
Spontaneous.
He did not know he was going to abduct a child, but it wasn't Sarah. It was totally opportunistic. And what we know about child abductions, where there are stranger abductions, they are opportunistic. If you abduct a child and you know who that child is, which is the majority of the child abductions, then of course that's planned and you know who the child is. But when it's opportunistic, when it's not somebody known to the child, that is not planned in terms of who the victim is. So I believe that she walked out on the road and in a matter of seconds was abducted by a predator outside. Now, that supports all the evidence we know about looking at child abductions. Opportunistic, moment in time, matter of seconds and minutes before abducted, and obviously not known to the offender. And I believe that that's what's happened. And I sadly also, evidence tells us through the FBI child abduction manual, which is very, very detailed and very good because they've got 10 times as many child abductions and strange child abductions as we've had in the UK, that she would have been dead within 72 hours.
Oh, God. Awful. And do you think we'll ever know? Do you think we'll ever have concrete evidence for what happened?
Sadly, I think it's probably unlikely, but I always use a caveat is that we have to remain positive that one day we will, and I remain that with all my cases, that I remain positive that one day, ultimately, that offender will be brought to justice. And I have to believe that because otherwise there's no point in doing what I do. I will continue to fight for that justice, whether it be, the cases that we all know about, or other cases. I've got a case in Coventry, the disappearance of Nicola Payne, and she vanished and she's never been seen since. And I'm working on a program and a podcast now to get justice because I know who killed her.
Wow, that must be quite a lot to live with.
Yeah, and I think it's. I have a lot of information. I have a lot of information comes to me because of the type of work I do. So obviously I know about lots of operations that have been run. I know about lots of offenders out there where there isn't quite enough evidence to prosecute. I also know a lot of people's dark secrets. During the course of I investigated Max Clifford, and Max Clifford used to effectively blackmail some of his clients. And I've got a number of very high profile people who he blackmailed. And I know their stories about how he blackmailed them. The stories will never be told. They'll die with me. But, he destroyed lots of people's lives and in a very horrific way. So, yeah, I'm a keeper of a lot of secrets.
The thing that strikes me is, so I've got a young daughter. And the thing you just told me about Madeleine McCann is something that will kind of stay with me for a little while. It's awful. I couldn't do what you do. I couldn't be immersed in that world non-stop and just sort of see that darkness. Yeah. And doubly, I couldn't do it where the cases might not be solved. No. If there was a constant sense of closure, that's something. For things that, like you said right at the beginning of the conversation, that are just running on and potentially there will never be closure. Does it affect you? Yeah.
I'd be... If you asked me that question 10 years ago, I'd probably say no. I'd probably say, no, I get on with it. No, over the last 3 years, I have struggled with my mental health. There's no doubt that these things have impacted on me. You can't see what I see and not be affected by it. You can't take on the responsibility of helping people who I come into people's lives at the most traumatic time of their life. And by and large, particularly the work I do now, I'm their last hope. Everything else they've tried the police, they've tried every other aspect, and they've been let down, they've been failed. And I come along and they see it as a glimmer of hope. And I always try to keep that realistic balance there, because I say to them, look, I can't tell you I'll solve this. I can't tell you I will catch the offender. I will tell you, if I take this case on, that I'll get you new information. There isn't a single case that I've worked on, and I can say this confidently now. I thought about this, probably about 2-3 years ago, just before I released my book, Hunting Killers, and I thought to myself, do I always make a difference? And I've looked at every case, and I can tell you categorically, every case I've worked on, I have found new information. I went out to Kuala Lumpur to investigate the death of a young girl who ended up falling 9 stories and dead on the floor. And I went over there and I did an investigation. And as a direct result of my investigation, it was opened up as a homicide. I was convinced that her death wasn't suicide, which is what they put it down to. And it was opened up as a homicide. So every time I find new information, and I suppose that's my mantra really. So I'm always confident that when I take a case on and I keep chipping away at it and working at it. And some of these cases, it's healthy to put them down for a couple of months, 6 months, 7 months, and pick them up again. And you sometimes see things differently. Plus also, I take on cases that I don't get paid for. So I have to balance that around the work that I do get paid for. And it does affect you. And it affects you because I'm still a human being. There's a couple of tracks, music tracks, which accompany a couple of really horrific child abuse videos that still sit in my head. And and those tracks, and I hear them at certain times of the year, because one of them is a Christmas track, always kind of stops me in my track when I hear it. And there are other times when things come back to me. I've seen the most horrific injuries to people, and certain times something will happen and you'll see something and it will just bring back a memory. And I've worked really hard at that. I've spoken to, I've had some therapy around that to be able to deal with that. And I think I live in a dark world. I live in a pretty dark world, and I have to make sure that I come out of that. So I work really hard. I train fitness. I gym regularly. I look after myself. I eat well. I've got a good family support around me, and I think it's really hard. I've got a great partner who's very supportive, and I think that whole process is really important, because if you don't have that support around you, then you just live in a dark world all the time.
Well, look, Mark, it's been just as fascinating to have you back a second time as the first time. And I'm just really grateful there are people like you out there who are dedicating your time to finding justice for these people who've been treated terribly. So great to meet you again, and thanks so much for your time.
Great to talk. Thank you.
It happened very, very quickly. I didn't expect it to happen that quick. We literally had the evidence. He was meant to turn up with his camper van and take a 13-year-old girl to a campsite where he intended on obviously doing what he said he was going to do.